911, what's the location of the emergency?
My daughter is missing. She's gone. We can't find her anywhere. I've called all her friends.
How old is she?
11.
And when was the last time that she was seen?
It was at 6 o'clock, Jean. Around 6 o'clock.
The body of a beautiful 11-year-old girl, Carly Brucia, has been found. Joseph Smith is under arrest for the abduction and murder of Carly.
Smith was sentenced to death, but this week a circuit judge ordered that he be given a new sentencing trial. This all stems from a recent Supreme Court ruling requiring juries to be unanimous when sentencing someone to death.
February 1st, 2004, Super Bowl Sunday. 90 million Americans were glued to their screens, nachos in hand, jerseys on, counting down to kickoff. From Boston to Charlotte, from New York City to small-town Texas, the whole country was locked in. Nobody was going anywhere, which is exactly why what happened next was so unthinkable. Because while the rest of America was celebrating in a quiet parking lot in Sarasota, Florida, in broad daylight, in plain sight of a public road, an 11-year-old girl was taken, not in the dead of night, not in some dark alley, in the middle of the evening on one of the most watched nights of the year, while life carried on just a few hundred feet away. And the most disturbing part, it was all caught on camera. A few grainy seconds of surveillance footage, a man in a mechanic's uniform, a little girl in a red t-shirt and a pink backpack, and then she's gone. Just like that. Led away by a stranger, and the world didn't even notice. Her resident date's name was Carly Brucia. She was sweet, energetic, the kind of kid who hugged everyone she met and lit up every room she walked into. She was heading home to watch the game with her family. She was less than a mile away. She never made it. This is a true crime documentary about what happened to Carly. And the jaw-dropping chain of events, confessions, coded letters, and devastating revelations that followed. What investigators uncovered in the days after her disappearance would shock the entire country and expose some serious, uncomfortable failures in the criminal justice system that allowed this to happen in the first place. Stay with us, because this story is far more complicated and far darker than you might expect. Before we get into the investigation, the evidence, and the man who would eventually sit across from a jury and hear the word guilty, you need to know who Carly Brucia was. Because this true crime documentary isn't just about a case. It's about a little girl who deserves so much more than the hand she was dealt on that Sunday evening. Carly Jane Brucia was born on March 16, 1992, on Long Island, New York. She was the kind of kid who made a room feel warmer just by walking into it. Her teachers called her sweet and charming. Her school principal described her as a shining light. And that wasn't just something nice said after the fact. That was who Carly genuinely was, every single day. When she was still very young, her parents Joe and Susan divorced, and Carly moved with her mom down to Sarasota, Florida. But she never lost touch with her roots up north. Every winter break, every summer, she'd make that trip back to Long Island, and Christmas up there was her absolute favorite time of year. She was a kid who held on to the people she loved no matter the distance. Back in Sarasota, life was full. She was in the 6th grade at McIntosh Middle School, sang in the choir, loved sports, and was absolutely devoted to her cat. She was a huge Jennifer Lopez fan, the kind of girl who lived for trips to the mall with her friends and thought a good hug could fix just about anything. And honestly, for the people lucky enough to know her, it usually did. Her mom Susan had remarried. And by all accounts, Carly was close with her stepfather Stephen, too. She had a younger half-brother. She had a full life. A real, beautiful, ordinary American childhood. The kind that should have had decades left to unfold. And on the afternoon of February 1st, 2004, that's exactly what it looked like it would be. Carly had spent the night before at a friend's house. Nothing unusual, just a regular sleepover. By early evening on Super Bowl Sunday, she was ready to head home, just under a mile away, to be with her family for the game. Her friend's mom did the right thing and called Susan first just to check. Susan said no. She didn't want Carly walking alone along that stretch of road, so her stepfather Stephen got in the car to go pick her up. The streets were quiet. Most of Sarasota was inside, gathered around television sets, watching the pre-game coverage. It should have been a completely unremarkable evening. It wasn't. Stephen drove through the neighborhood and found nothing. No Carly walking along the sidewalk. No pink backpack bobbing down the street, just empty roads and porch lights. He drove around again. Still nothing. That's when the feeling hit him, the kind of feeling every parent dreads, that something was very, very wrong. About an hour later, a 911 call came in. Carly Bruscia, 11 years old, was officially reported missing.
911, what's the location of the emergency?
My daughter is missing. She's gone. We can't find her anywhere. I've called all her friends.
How old is she?
11.
And when was the last time that she was seen?
It was at 6 o'clock, Street. Around 6 o'clock.
And just like that, Super Bowl Sunday in Sarasota, Florida became something else entirely. When police arrived and started piecing together Carly's last known movements, they did what investigators always do first. They retraced her steps. They spoke to her friends, knocked on doors, walked the route she would have taken home. They brought in search dogs using one of Carly's pillowcases to give them a scent to follow. And that's when things got interesting. A bloodhound named Ruby picked up Carly's trail almost immediately. She tracked it through the neighborhood, nose down, steady and focused, until she stopped. Right behind a car wash on Bee Ridge Road, a place called Evie's Car Wash, sitting at 4715 Bee Ridge Road in Sarasota. Ruby had nothing after that. The scent just ended. Like Carly had been lifted right off the face of the earth, investigators secured the property and sat down with the owner, a man named Mike Evanoff. He told them the car wash had surveillance cameras, motion activated, covering multiple angles of the lot. Officers pulled up the footage and started going through it, camera by camera, angle by angle, hoping for anything useful. The first two cameras showed the main road and an empty parking lot. Nothing. And then they got to the third camera, the one positioned at the back of the property. Motion activated. And when they hit play on the recording time stamped 6:21 p.m., the exact window when Carly disappeared, what they saw made every officer in that room go completely still. A young girl in a red t-shirt, blue jeans, and a pink backpack walks into the frame. That was Carly. Exactly as she had been described, exactly what she'd been wearing. And then, within seconds, a man appears. He's around 5'8", dark hair, a tattoo visible on his arm, wearing a mechanic's work uniform with a name badge on the chest. The name is too blurry to read. He walks up to Carly, they exchange a few words, and then he reaches out, grabs her by the arm, and leads her away. The whole thing lasts just a few seconds. But those few seconds told investigators everything they needed to know. This was not a runaway. This was not a misunderstanding. This was an abduction, caught on tape in broad daylight on one of the busiest television nights in American history. The footage was released to the public almost immediately. And what happened next was something that doesn't occur very often in true crime investigations. The video went viral, before viral was even really a word people used. News stations across the country picked it up. It played on loop on every major network. People watched it at sports bars, still half-dressed in their Super Bowl gear. It spread across the internet, shared from inbox to inbox, message board to message board. Within hours, the face of that man in the mechanic's uniform was being studied by millions of Americans. Carly's father, Joe, held nothing back when he spoke to reporters. He pointed out that people had been less than 300 feet away when his daughter was taken, in broad daylight, on a public road, and nobody saw a thing. A $25,000 reward was announced for any information leading to the suspect's identification. The tip lines lit up immediately, hundreds of calls poured in, and investigators went back to that footage one more time, this time rewinding it just a little further back, and they found something they had initially missed. 3 minutes before Carly was taken, a pale yellow 1992 Buick Century station wagon had pulled into that same parking lot. It circled. Then it pulled back out onto Bee Ridge Road, slowed down alongside the car wash, and turned back in. Deliberate, calculated, predatory. Now they had two things to go on, a face and a vehicle. And somewhere out there someone knew exactly who both of them belonged to. The clock was ticking. And deep down, every investigator on that case already knew what that usually meant for a missing child. With the surveillance footage now playing on television sets from coast to coast, investigators were buried in tips. More than 800 calls came flooding into the tip lines within the first couple of days. People from all over Florida, all over the country, were calling in with names, descriptions, hunches, the kind of response that only happens when a case grabs the entire nation by the collar and refuses to let go. But out of all those calls, several of them kept pointing to the same name. Different callers, different connections, same person. And it wasn't long before that name landed on the desk of Detective Vincent Reaver. Joseph Peter Smith, 37 years old, originally from Brooklyn, New York, an unemployed mechanic and father of 3, living in Sarasota and renting a room from a local couple. And the moment investigators started pulling his background, the picture that emerged was deeply troubling. Smith had at least 13 arrests in the state of Florida going back to 1993, heroin possession, prescription and drug fraud, cocaine possession. He had served time in custody, and just 8 days after his release, he was arrested again. He had previously been charged with kidnapping and false imprisonment, and had walked away acquitted. And in the weeks leading up to Super Bowl Sunday, he had violated the terms of his probation, again, and had been released anyway. But one call stood out from all the rest. A woman who had worked with Smith at a repair shop called police and told them she recognized him the moment she saw the footage. She didn't hesitate for a second. She told investigators she knew exactly how he moved, how he carried himself, how he reached. She watched him grab Carly's arm on that screen and said it looked exactly the way he used to reach for his tools. Her husband called it in immediately. Detective Reaver drove to Smith's address with backup. A neighbor confirmed someone was home. Officers knocked, no answer. That's when they learned Smith was currently on probation, which gave them a different avenue. They contacted his probation officer and requested they come to the scene. While they waited, a woman pulled up to the property. Her name was Naomi, one of the homeowners whose spare room Smith rented, and she was driving a pale yellow Buick Century station wagon. Officers brought Smith outside to speak with them, and the moment they showed him a still image from the car wash surveillance footage, his response said everything. He looked at it, paused, and said, "That looks like me, but it's not me."
Is that? I have the slightest idea, so it's definitely not me. It does look like me, doesn't it, though? Yeah, it kind of looks like you. That's why we're talking to you. Wow. Yeah, that definitely would not be me there. Honest. The deputies that you spoke to that night think that that's you. It's not me. Blow it up. Do what you got to do. Verify my time, where I was. You know, I'm more than glad to work for you guys and anything. Believe me, there is no way. I mean, that was me. Honest to God, no way at all. I would never put anybody through that. No way. How do we get past that, though? That's verifying where I was at 6:21.
He agreed to let officers search his car and his room. He seemed calm, cooperative even, and initially nothing directly connecting him to Carly turned up. But investigators did find something in his room. A mechanic's-style work uniform, complete with a name badge on the chest, and inside his vehicle drug paraphernalia. That was enough. Smith was arrested on the spot for violating his probation and for possession charges. But here's where the investigation hit its first real wall. While officers were processing the scene, Naomi's husband Jeff showed up. And what he said stopped everyone cold. His wife had gotten the timeline wrong. She had made a mistake. Jeff was the one who drove that Buick, and when he went to check on it, he noticed immediately that things inside had been moved around. The back seat had been folded down. He handed the vehicle over to the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office for forensic processing without hesitation, and just like that, Smith's alibi collapsed. He was read his Miranda rights. He asked for a lawyer. And the investigation shifted into a new, more urgent gear, because Carly had now been missing for days, and every hour that passed made the outcome less and less likely to be the one her family was praying for. Meanwhile, someone else was about to walk into a police station and change everything.
We gotta sit down and we have to talk. This room is not the truth. It's the most important thing that goes on in this room is the truth.
I was already advised to talk to a lawyer.
Who advised you?
Friend of mine.
That means you and I can't.
We should talk to a lawyer.
On the evening of February 4th, a man walked into the police station and asked to speak with the FBI. His name was John Smith, Joseph's brother. And from the moment he sat down, it was clear this conversation was going to matter. John was careful with his words. He told agents that he and Joseph weren't close, that their relationship was strained, but he also told them something that the investigators found extremely interesting. On the evening of February 1st, the same night Carly disappeared, Joseph had called him around 8 o'clock. They didn't talk the following day. But then John and his girlfriend sat down to watch the news, and the surveillance footage from the car wash came on the screen. John recognized his brother immediately. So did his girlfriend. She pointed to the way the man walked. Joseph had undergone back surgery at some point, and had permanently changed his gait. He was unmistakable to anyone who knew him. There was no doubt in either of their minds. But John kept talking, and what he told investigators next painted an even more unsettling picture of the hours after Carly's abduction. Later that same night, around 11 o'clock, Joseph had shown up at John's front door. He looked like he may have been under the influence of something. He was wearing his usual mechanic's work uniform, but his regular sneakers were gone. Instead, he had on a pair of boots John had never seen before, brand new by the look of them. Joseph didn't say much. He just looked at his brother and asked, "Do you want to talk about something?" John said no, and shut the door. The next morning, Joseph showed up at the place where John worked, and his behavior was strange enough that it stuck with John days later when he was recounting it to federal agents. Joseph kept washing his hands, over and over compulsively, even when they were already clean. And at some point during that morning, he pulled John aside and told him he might need to leave the state. Urgently. Soon. John told the agents plainly. If his brother was guilty, he would never admit it. He said he'll take this to the grave. You're not going to get the truth out of him. His advice was to stop waiting for a confession and focus entirely on building the physical evidence. Investigators took that seriously. They went back to the footage and reached out to NASA. Yes, NASA. To help enhance the image quality and make out what was written on the name badge in the video. When the enhancement came back, the name on the badge was clear. It read Joe. But the case was about to break wide open in a way nobody expected. And it started with a phone call that John Smith made, thinking he was being monitored. After Joseph was brought in and jailed on the probation violation, he was allowed a private visit with his brother and their mother. About 90 minutes later, John walked out of that room visibly shaken. He told officers that Joseph had come close to saying something, really close, but hadn't directly confessed. Officers took that at face value and moved on. No surveillance was placed on John, no further questioning of the mother, a rescission that would turn out to be one of the most critical oversights of the entire investigation. And because later that evening John picked up the phone and called the FBI, he thought his line was being tapped. It wasn't. And the moment he said, "I'm guessing you've already heard, what am I supposed to do now?" Agents on the other end of the line realized something extraordinary had just happened. Joseph had told his brother exactly what he needed to tell him. And John, believing every word of that conversation was already being recorded, was calling to follow up. 3 agents were in their cars within minutes, heading straight to John's house. And that's where John Smith finally told the truth. Joseph had confessed. Not in the clean, courtroom-ready way investigators had hoped for. But he had told his brother enough. He had apologized. He had broken down. And when John pushed him directly and said the words out loud, "Okay, Joe, she's gone. Where is she? We have to find her," Joseph gave him a location. 6221 Proctor Road, near Interstate 75, behind Central Church of Christ. Officers moved immediately. In the early hours of the morning, in thick brush at the edge of a field behind that church, they found Carly Brucia. She was 4 days gone, and the details of how she was found, and what the medical examiner would later confirm, are the kind of things that stay with investigators, prosecutors, and jurors for the rest of their lives. John also admitted he had gone out there himself after leaving the police station, not to report it, but to see if any part of his brother's story was even true. He said that if he had found Carly alive, his plan was to free her, give her some money, take a photograph, sell it to the media, and use the money to hire Joseph a good lawyer. It is one of the most jaw-dropping admissions in this entire true crime case. And it raises questions that don't have clean answers. But one thing was no longer in question. Joseph Peter Smith had taken Carly Brucia. And now the full weight of the American justice system was about to come down on him. When investigators got to work processing the evidence in this case, what they assembled was the kind of file that prosecutors dream about and defense attorneys lose sleep over. Layer after layer of physical, forensic, and testimonial evidence. Each one damning on its own. And together, absolutely overwhelming. Let's start with the DNA. When the medical examiner processed Carly's clothing, forensic analysts found a semen stain on her t-shirt. They ran it against Joseph Smith's DNA profile. The match came back positive, and the statistical probability of that being coincidence, of a random Caucasian male being the source of that biological evidence, was 1 in 32 quintillion. To put that number in perspective, there are an estimated 8 billion people on the planet. 1 in 32 quintillion is not a probability. It is a certainty. But the DNA was just the beginning. Inside Naomi and Jeff's yellow Buick Century station wagon, the vehicle Smith had been driving on the evening of February 1st, investigators found 2 of Carly's hairs. They also recovered 7 individual fibers from the interior of that vehicle that were forensically matched to the fabric of Carly's red t-shirt. The car told a story that no amount of cleanup had been able to erase. Carly Bruscia had been inside that vehicle. The science was unambiguous. Then there was the coded letter. While Joseph Smith sat in custody awaiting trial, he did something that investigators can only describe as breathtakingly reckless. He wrote a letter to his brother John. But because he knew his mail was being monitored, he wrote it in code. An encrypted message he clearly believed would be unreadable to anyone but John. He was wrong. The FBI decoded it. And what it said was extraordinary. In plain language, once decoded, the letter revealed that Smith had disposed of Carly's clothing and her pink backpack in 4 separate dumpsters across the area. A deliberate attempt to scatter the evidence and make recovery as difficult as possible. He also described dragging her body to the student location where it was eventually found. And at the end of the letter, in what can only be described as a chilling display of calculated thinking even if from behind bars, he told John to destroy the letter after decoding it and to keep his mouth shut. The letter was never destroyed, and it became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence the prosecution would carry into that courtroom. The medical examiner's findings added yet another devastating layer to the case. The autopsy confirmed that Carly had been restrained. Ligature marks on her wrists told that story clearly. The cause of death was determined to be ligature strangulation, and the forensic evidence confirmed that she had been assaulted before her death. The timeline and the nature of the injuries painted Brigitte a picture of a deliberate, premeditated violence. Not the impulsive act of someone in a momentary frenzy, but something far more calculated and far more cold. And then there was the confession itself, or rather the series of partial admissions that added up to one. Joseph had told his brother he was sorry for what he did. He had described the assault inside the vehicle. He had directed John to the exact location of Carly's body with enough specificity that officers found her in the dark, in thick brush in the early hours of the morning. And in a recorded jail phone call with his mother, a call he did not know was being preserved as evidence. The conversation made clear that even his own family understood what he had done. His mother urged him to say it was an accident. His response was simple. "But it was an accident, Mom. I would never have done this on purpose." That recorded conversation would later be played for a jury of 12 Americans who had been asked to decide his fate. Investigators also confirmed through careful reconstruction of the surveillance footage and the vehicle's movements that Smith had not stumbled into that car-washed parking lot by chance. The way the Buick circled, slowed, and repositioned itself in the minutes before Carly appeared on camera indicated deliberate strategic maneuvering. He had been watching. He had been waiting. And when the moment presented itself, he moved. For the defense, there was very little to work with. They challenged the authenticity of the digital surveillance footage, arguing the prosecution couldn't definitively confirm the accuracy of its timestamp. They also argued that the FBI's arrangement of the private meeting between Joseph and his brother, after Joseph had already invoked his right to remain silent and requested an attorney, amounted to an unlawful interrogation. The FBI pushed back, stating clearly that it was John who had insisted on speaking with his brother, and that the meeting had only taken place after Joseph's own attorneys had signed off on it. Neither argument gained meaningful traction, because when you stack surveillance footage, DNA evidence, fiber, analysis, hair evidence, a decoded encrypted letter, recorded phone call admissions, and the fact that the defendant personally directed investigators to the victim's body, there is very little a defense attorney can say to a jury that is going to change the outcome. Joseph Peter Smith was about to find that out firsthand. By the time Joseph Peter Smith's trial got underway in November of 2005, the Carly Bruscia case had been sitting in the American consciousness for nearly 2 years. The surveillance footage had never really gone away. People hadn't forgotten. And when jury selection began, finding 12 men and women in Florida who hadn't already seen that video, who hadn't already felt something deep and visceral watching those few seconds of footage, was no small task. Trial began on November 7, 2005. The jury that was ultimately seated consisted of 8 women and 4 men, and from the moment opening statements began, it was clear that this was not going to be a case built on reasonable doubt. This was going to be a case built on an avalanche. Prosecutor Deborah Rivar laid it out methodically and without theatrics. The surveillance footage, the DNA, the fibers, the hair evidence, the coded letter, the recorded phone calls, the fact that Joseph Smith had personally guided investigators to the location of Carly's body in the dark. She didn't need to dramatize any of it. The facts spoke with a volume that no courtroom rhetoric could match. The defense did what defense attorneys are obligated to do. They pushed back on every piece of evidence they could find a foothold on. They questioned the integrity of the digital footage. They revisited the circumstances of the jail meeting between Joseph and his brother. They argued that the confession was ambiguous, indirect, and legally compromised. And in a courtroom setting, where the burden of proof sits entirely on the prosecution's shoulders, those arguments deserve to be made. That is how the system is designed to work. But the evidence was simply too deep and too wide for any of it to land with the jury. And then came the witnesses. John Smith took the stand, and his testimony was complicated from the start. Prosecutor Rivar asked the judge to declare John a hostile witness, a legal designation that allows an attorney to cross-examine their own witness more aggressively when that witness is being uncooperative or evasive. The judge agreed. And what followed was one of the most uncomfortable stretches of testimony in the entire trial. John was at that moment facing his own legal troubles. He had been charged with drug possession and armed robbery. And when he took the stand, it was reported that he admitted to being under the influence of crack cocaine at the time he testified. The defense, understandably, did everything they could to use that detail to undermine his credibility. But here's the thing about John Smith's testimony, the core of what he said. The confession his brother made, the directions to the body, the decoded letter, was corroborated by physical evidence that existed completely independent of anything John said. The DNA didn't need John's testimony to be true. The fibers didn't need it. The hair evidence didn't need it. The recorded jail phone call with their mother didn't need it. John's credibility as a witness could be questioned 6 ways from Sunday, and none of it changed the scientific reality sitting in that evidence file. The recorded phone call between Joseph and his mother was played for the jury. The courtroom went quiet in that particular way that only happens when something truly heavy fills the air. Hearing a man tell his mother that what he did was an accident, hearing her respond that she knew he would never have done it on purpose, that everyone was furious, that the community, the press, the governor, the mayor were all demanding answers, landed with a weight that no closing argument could manufacture. The jury also heard from the Sarasota County Corrections deputy, who had been monitoring Smith's jail calls and had overheard him describing the location of Carly's body, between 2 trees, not too far back, maybe around the tree line. A detail so specific, so calm, so matter-of-fact, that it silenced the room all over again. After all the evidence was presented, after every witness had been examined and cross-examined, after both sides had made their closing arguments, the jury deliberated, and they did not take long. On November the 17th, 2005, 10 days after the trial began, the verdict came in. The jury found Joseph Peter Smith guilty on all counts: kidnapping, sexual battery, first-degree murder, every single charge. And in the penalty phase that followed, the jury voted 10-2 in favor of sentencing him to death by lethal injection. In Florida at that time, a jury recommendation for death did not require unanimity. 10 votes were enough. And 10 votes were exactly what the prosecution got. Joseph Smith stood before the court and asked for mercy. He said he was doing it for the sake of his family. He said he didn't know how any of it had happened. He said he had been heavily under the influence of drugs and remembered almost nothing about that day. And then he said something that stopped a lot of people cold. He said he took full responsibility for the crimes, that he knew using drugs was wrong but couldn't stop, that he wasn't trying to make excuses. It was the closest thing to a direct public admission the world had ever heard from Joseph Peter Smith, and it came far too late to matter in any meaningful way to the people sitting in that courtroom. Carly's stepfather, Stephen, sat through the sentencing and said afterward that he had expected to feel different when it was finally over. He thought a verdict would bring some kind of relief, some sense of resolution. Instead, he said it still hurt just as much. The only difference, he said, was that he finally felt like Carly had been heard. Carly's mother, Susan, was not in the courtroom when the sentence was announced. She was in custody at the time on charges related to drug use, a heartbreaking detail that speaks to just how completely and permanently the murder of her daughter had dismantled her world. She later said publicly that she had turned to substances to try to numb a pain that had no bottom. On March 15, 2006, Judge Andrew Owens made it official. He sentenced Joseph Peter Smith to death, and the words he spoke from the bench that day are worth sitting with for a moment. He said that Carly had endured unimaginable suffering from the very moment she was taken, that the image of the defendant grabbing her by the arm and leading her away was something permanently burned into the memory of everyone who had seen it, that at 11 years old, Carly had understood the hopelessness of her situation, that her death was conscious, ruthless, carefully planned, and deliberately carried out. And then he looked directly at Joseph Smith and said, "Through your actions, you have forfeited the right to live freely among us. May God have mercy on your soul." The courtroom was silent, and then it was over. Or at least it was supposed to be.
Defendant is guilty of murder in the first
Smith was sentenced to death, but this week a circuit judge ordered that he be given a new sentencing trial. This all stems from a recent Supreme Court ruling requiring juries to be unanimous when sentencing someone to death.
I don't feel it has anything to do about justice or the law.
Carly's father, Joe Brucia, is furious.
They seem indifferent to the victims and their families. They think they can just do these things without affecting people, but it affects people a lot. He does not deserve to live on the taxpayers' expense any longer.
Joe Brucia and his family are writing letters asking the governor and the attorney general to step in.
Do the right thing. Do what the state of Florida promised my family and I. And that is to put Joseph Smith to death. And that's, he killed my daughter.
In 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court declared the Florida law unconstitutional since the death penalty could be imposed without a unanimous jury verdict. In 2018, the Florida Supreme Court also dropped Smith's death sentence. It was reinstated in 2020. Now, nearly a year later, the Florida Supreme Court has ordered a new sentencing hearing for Smith. A circuit court will only consider Smith's sentence and not his conviction. A hearing date has yet to be set.
When Judge Owens handed down that death sentence in March of 2006, most people who had followed this case assumed it was finally over. That Joseph Peter Smith would sit on death row, exhaust his appeals, and eventually face the punishment a jury of his peers had unanimously agreed he deserved. That Carly's family would be able to grieve without the constant reminder of courtrooms and hearings and legal proceedings pulling them back into the worst chapter of their lives over and over again. That is not what happened. What followed the sentencing was a legal saga that stretched across 15 years and exposed some of the deepest fault lines in the American criminal justice system. Fault lines that Carly's father Joe had been pointing to since the very beginning, long before any verdict was ever read. The appeals started almost immediately. For years, none of them gained traction. Smith's attorneys cycled through various arguments, challenging procedural decisions, evidentiary rulings, and the constitutionality of various aspects of his trial. The courts consistently held firm. The conviction stood. The sentence stood. And for a while, it looked like the legal process, however slow and grinding, was going to reach the conclusion everyone expected. Then in 2016, the United States Supreme Court issued a ruling in a case called Hurst versus Florida. The decision found that Florida's death sentencing scheme at the time was unconstitutional because it gave too much power to judges rather than juries in the final determination of a death sentence. It was a sweeping ruling that affected dozens of death row cases across the state, and Joseph Smith's case was among them. In 2018, Smith's death sentence was overturned on the basis of the Hurst decision. It was a legal development that sent shockwaves through the Sarasota community and hit Carly's family like a second blow they had never seen coming. After everything, the trial, the verdict, the sentencing, the years of waiting, the legal system had found a procedural opening and walked right through it. But the Florida State Attorney's Office was not finished. They pushed back hard, filing motions to reinstate the sentence and fighting the resentencing process at every turn. By 2020, after 2 more years of legal back and forth, Smith's death sentence was reinstated. The case was heading toward yet another chapter. And then nature intervened in a way that no courtroom ever could. On July 26, 2021, 17 years after Carly Brucia was taken from that parking lot in Sarasota, Joseph Peter Smith died inside Union Correctional Institution in Rayford, Florida. He was 55 years old. Initial reports left the cause of death undisclosed, but it was later reported that he had died from liver cancer, with some sources also citing complications from hepatitis C. He died without ever being officially executed, without ever being strapped to a gurney in a state facility and receiving the sentence that judge had handed down in that Sarasota courtroom back in 2006. The legal system, for all its years of proceedings and appeals and rulings and counter-rulings, never actually carried out the punishment it had promised. Carly's father, Joe, did not mince words when he heard the news. He said he felt relief. He said it had been a long time coming, and then he said something that cut straight to the heart of everything this case had exposed. He said the system had failed to carry it out, that it was unprofessional and corrupt, and that in the end, the natural order of things had set it right. Joe had been saying something like that for years, long before Smith died, long before the Hearst decision, long before the appeals and the resentencing battles. Because for Carly's father, the deepest wound was not the trial or the verdict or even the prolonged legal aftermath. The deepest wound was the fact that none of it should have been necessary in the first place. Joseph Smith had been on probation when he took Carly. He had violated the terms of that probation, not once, but multiple times. He had been found unconscious in a parking lot with cocaine. The conditions of his probation required that he be sent back to prison for 5 years if he violated. That was the deal. That was the promise the system had made. And instead of honoring it, authorities had placed him on what was called drug offender probation, a reclassification that kept him on the street. 8 days after that decision, Carly Bruscia was taken from a car wash parking lot in broad daylight. Joe reached out to Representative Katherine Harris, a Florida congresswoman, and asked her to do something, anything, that would make sure no other parent ever had to sit where he was sitting. Representative Harris responded. She introduced a legislative proposal that became known as Carly's Law. Standing at a press conference, she said they needed to act immediately to protect children from repeat offenders who took the second chances given to them by society and used them to commit new acts of violence. Representative Nick Lampson of Texas came on board as a co-sponsor. The bill had momentum. It had public support. It had the full moral weight of what had happened to an 11-year-old girl in Sarasota, Florida behind it. But Carly's Law was never passed. The primary obstacle was cost. The head of the state prison system estimated that reincarcerating people with criminal histories similar to Smith's would cost close to $1 billion. And when that number hit the floor of the legislature, the momentum stalled. The bill died without a vote. Joe's response to that was direct and without apology. He said he found it deeply offensive that anyone would put a price on his daughter's life or on the life of any child. Representative Harris promised to reintroduce the bill in expanded form, with a broader focus on closing gaps in child protection laws. That promise was never kept. The bill was never reintroduced. Carly's Law, the one tangible legislative legacy that might have carried her name forward and protected other children, simply disappeared into the machinery of American politics and was never heard from again. Meanwhile, another shadow fell across the case from an entirely unexpected direction.
It's hard to believe 10 years ago this week, a little Sarasota girl was abducted at a car wash, sparking a search that captured the attention of the entire country.
10 years ago today, the world witnessed a kidnapping caught on tape. Carly Bruscia would be found days later, murdered. She was only 11. Her body left behind a church. And now, a decade later, that church still honors that little girl by trying to protect other children.
Such a tragic to Carly, but it's helped a lot of young other kids now.
Stephen Kanzler, Carly Bruscia's stepfather, addressing the large crowd gathered at the Central Church of Christ. Her mother, Susan Shorpen, too emotional to speak, at the place her daughter's body was found 4 days after her abduction.
Hopefully it made kids aware and adults aware, it can happen to you. You hear about it being somewhere else. You never think it'll happen here in your backyard.
The massive search and the tragic discovery hard to forget, even for seasoned officers who attended the memorial.
For something like this to happen to her, I think it is probably our worst nightmare, but it's also gave us that sense of vigilance, and that's what I think really drove us all together to try to bring him to justice.
Smith sits on death row, but in the past 10 years, the church has worked with the community, sponsoring 8 kid safety rallies, among other campaigns, all in memory of a little girl gone too soon.
We're going to keep Carly's memory alive. This will always be a place in this community where you can come, where you can remember, and where you can recommit yourself to taking care of the kids in our community.
After Smith's death, the Bradenton Police Department confirmed publicly that Joseph Smith had been considered a suspect in a second murder. The 2000 killing of a 25-year-old woman named Tara Riley, whose body had been found in a retention pond behind a Walmart in Florida. The case had gone cold years earlier, but a recorded phone call from Smith's time in prison had surfaced in which his brother John, who had actually known Tara Riley personally, having worked with her, was asked directly by family members whether investigators had asked Joseph about her. John's conviction on the matter was absolute. He told reporters that Tara had rejected Joseph before her death, and that in his opinion that humiliation had become the motive. He said he was convinced his brother was responsible. He said he hoped the case would be solved before Joseph died. It wasn't. Joseph Smith died and without ever being charged in connection with Tara Riley's murder. Her case remains officially unsolved to this day. And with Smith gone, the truth about what he may or may not have done, the full scope of the damage he caused, will in all likelihood never be fully known. John Smith, for his part, carried the weight of this case in his own complicated way until the very end. He had testified against his brother. He had led police to Carly's body. He had decoded the moral horror of what his own family member had done and made a choice, however imperfect and however delayed, to tell the truth. And after Joseph died, John said something quietly devastating in a single sentence. He said his brother never truly confessed, never took real responsibility, died without saying the words out loud. And then John said, "He died a coward, that's all." The ripple effects of Carly's murder extended far beyond the courtroom and the legislature. Her grandmother, by some accounts, simply could not survive the grief. People close to the family said she died of a broken heart. Her grandfather left the United States entirely and moved to Europe, where he later passed away as well. Carly's uncle died in a truck accident that some believe may not have been an accident at all. One child gone in seconds from a car wash parking lot on a Super Bowl Sunday. And the destruction that followed moved outward like a wave, touching everyone in its path, reshaping every life it reached.
To me, it's just a nice place to spend some of my time.
Thinks about Carly Bruscia more than most.
They found her was right on the edge of the, just about where this rock is.
He's the caretaker of her memorial at the Central Church of Christ. He comes here to reflect about Bruscia, and he remembers his own granddaughter, who was murdered years ago.
But when you lose someone, a family member, it's just nice to have a place to go sit and enjoy the solitude.
He's unsure what to think of the news that Bruscia's killer, Joseph Smith, is going to be resentenced.
I have real mixed feelings about it. Another life taken doesn't bring Carly back, but at the same time, like I say, justice should be carried out to whatever extent of the law.
Out to us again, pleading for your help to restore this garden that you see right over there.
It's dying. People are forgetting.
At one time, dozens of volunteers came every week to care for the memorial garden for 11-year-old Carly Bruscia. Now it's neglected and vandalized. Family friend Sherry Langworthy, she and her husband, along with Carly's cousin, have worked the last 3 weeks trying to restore the garden.
I want her legacy, her memory to live on, and I want it to be kind of like an awareness thing, for parents to take their kids here and teach them, what can happen.
Local volunteers and businesses help to maintain the garden.
The Florida State Attorney's Office, upon learning of Smith's death, released a statement saying that while nothing could ever bring Carly back, they were grateful her family and the Sarasota community could finally have a sense of closure, and would no longer be forced to endure additional court proceedings. Closure. It is a word that gets used a lot in true crime cases, and it is a word that the people who actually live through these stories tend to push back on hardest, because for Carly's father Joe, for her stepfather Stephen, for her mother Susan, who turned to substances to survive a grief that had no floor, closure is not really the right word for any of it. What they have is survival. What they have is memory. What they have is a daughter and a stepdaughter and a little girl who sang in the choir and loved Jennifer Lopez and gave everyone she met a hug, and who deserved every single year of the life that was taken from her in that parking lot. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with losing a child of violence. It does not follow the stages. It does not resolve on a timeline. It does not respond to verdicts or sentencing hearings or the death of the man responsible. It simply lives inside the people who carry it, reshaping everything around it for the rest of their lives. For the Brucia family, that grief has been a constant companion for over 2 decades now. And yet, in the middle of all of it, something else has persisted alongside the pain, something quieter and more stubborn. The memory of who Carly actually was, not the victim on the news, not the face on the missing child flyer, not the name attached to a piece of legislation that never passed, but the real girl, the one who hugged everyone she met, the one who sang in the choir and adored her cat and thought Christmas on Long Island was the greatest thing in the world. Her father Joe has spoken about this more than once in the years since her death. He said that his family talks about Carly all the time, that her photographs are all over the house, that she is always in their hearts and always in their thoughts, not as a case number or a cautionary tale or a symbol of systemic failure, though she is all of those things too, but as their daughter, their Carly, the shining light her school principal once described, still shining in the only way she can now, through the people who refuse to let her memory go dark. And that refusal matters, because the alternative, allowing Carly Brucia to exist in the public consciousness only as a tragedy, only as a data point in a conversation about criminal justice reform, only as the girl in the red t-shirt and the pink backpack on a grainy surveillance video, would be a second injustice layered on top of the first. This true crime documentary has walked you through the facts of what happened. The abduction, the investigation, the evidence, the trial, the sentencing, the appeals, the death of the man convicted of taking her life. But facts, as important as they are, can only carry a story so far. At some point, the facts have to give way to something harder and more honest. The acknowledgement that behind every case file, every piece of forensic evidence, every courtroom proceeding in a story like this, there was a human being, a child, a whole person with a future that stretched out ahead of her. Carly Brucia should have graduated middle school. She should have gone to high school dances and argued with her parents about curfews and discovered the music that would define her teenage years. She should have figured out what she wanted to do with her life, fallen in and out of love, built something of her own. She was 11 years old. She had barely gotten started, and the community of Sarasota understood that from the very beginning. The mayor called her the child of Sarasota. Thousands of people who had never met her showed up to search for her, to hold vigils outside her home, to lay flowers near the church where her body was found. Banners and signs read, "We love you, Carly." Her school opened its doors for counseling when the news came in, because the grief of losing her was not contained to her family. It spread through an entire city like something in the air. That kind of communal mourning is rare. It speaks to something about Carly that even the people who only knew her through a news story seem to feel instinctively, that this was not just a statistic, that this one hurt differently. But the legacy of this case is not only about grief, it is also about accountability. And on that front, the story is more complicated and more uncomfortable. Joseph Smith should have been in prison when he took Carly Brucia. That is not an opinion or an emotional reaction. That is a factual statement supported by the terms of his own probation agreement. He had violated those terms. The system had the authority and the obligation to act on that violation. It chose not to. And 8 days later, an 11-year-old girl was abducted from a car wash parking lot in broad daylight. Carly's law was the attempt to turn that failure into something preventive, to close the gap that allowed a man with Joseph Smith's history to remain free and unsupervised on the streets of a Florida community. The fact that it never passed, that it died quietly under the weight of projected costs and legislative inertia, is a part of this story that deserves to sit uncomfortably with all of us. Because the question Carly's father Joe asked is not a rhetorical one. It is a real question, with real stakes. How many times does the system have to fail before the failure becomes unacceptable? That question does not have a clean answer. It never does in cases like this. The criminal justice system is enormous and imperfect, and full of human beings, making judgment calls under pressure with incomplete information. Most of those judgment calls are made in good faith. Some of them are catastrophically wrong, and the people who pay the price for the catastrophically wrong ones are almost never the people who made them. Tara Riley paid a price. If John Smith's conviction about his brother's involvement is correct, and that has never been proven in a court of law, then a 25-year-old woman lost her life years before Carly did, and her case has sat cold and unresolved ever since. Her family has lived with that open wound for over 2 decades, and with Joseph Smith dead, the likelihood of it ever being officially closed is vanishingly small. These are the parts of true crime stories that the headlines don't linger on long enough. The cases within the cases. The victims who don't get the documentaries or the viral footage or the legislative proposals in their name. The families who are still waiting for answers that will probably never come. Carly's mother, Susan, spent years struggling with the weight of what happened to her daughter. The grief cracked her open in ways that led her down paths no parent should have to walk. She has spoken honestly about turning to substances to try to survive a pain that felt unsurvivable. Her story is not one of weakness. It is one of a human being confronted with something that no human being is built to carry, doing the best she could with whatever was left of herself. After February 1st, 2004 took everything else away. Her stepfather Stephen sat through an entire trial and sentencing, steeled himself for the emotional impact of a verdict, and then found that it didn't feel the way he expected it to. He said he still hurt just as much, that the only difference was that he finally felt like Carly had been heard. That is what justice looks like in the real world, far more often than people want to admit. Not resolution, not relief, just the quiet, hard-won feeling that the person you lost was not forgotten, that their name was spoken out loud in a place that mattered, that someone was held accountable. Carly was heard. That much is true. And now, more than 20 years after a bloodhound named Ruby followed a little girl's scent to the back of a car wash on Bee Ridge Road and stopped. Because the trail simply ended. Because she had been lifted away into a nightmare. Carly Bruscia is still being heard. In the conversations her family has around the dinner table, in the photographs covering the walls of her father's home, in the memory of every person in Sarasota who tied a ribbon or held a candle or stood outside a church in the dark because they needed to do something, anything, to honor a child they had never met but somehow felt they knew. She was the kind of person who made people feel that way. Even strangers. Even people who only knew her from a news story. That is not something that can be manufactured or scripted or edited into existence. That is just who Carly Bruscia was. She was 11 years old. She sang in the choir. She gave everyone she met a hug. She was on her way home to watch the Super Bowl with her family on a quiet Sunday evening in Sarasota, Florida, and she deserved every single year she never got to live. This has been a true crime documentary on the case of Carly Bruscia. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you angry in the way that demands something be done, hold on to that feeling, because the children in these stories are not just cases. They are not just content. They are people who were here, who mattered, and who deserve to be remembered as exactly that. Thank you for watching.